50 miles from Lake Michigan, an invasion just stops. Not slows down. Stops. For over a decade, a fish that crossed nearly the entire length of a major American river system, breeding by the millions and swallowing every meal in its path, has refused to cross that final stretch of water. There is no dam, no net, no wall visible from a boat. And for years, nobody could explain why one of the most aggressive invasive species in North American history simply declined to finish what it started. Now scientists say they know what stopped it, and the answer has almost nothing to do with the giant, toothy predator that half the Midwest was hoping had solved the problem for them. To understand why that empty stretch of river matters, you have to go back to the 1970s, to a decision that made perfect sense at the time. Catfish farmers across the southern United States were losing entire ponds overnight. Algae blooms would choke the water, strip out the oxygen while everyone slept, and by morning the fish were dead. The solution came from Asia, where a family of fish known as silver carp and bighead carp had spent millions of years doing exactly the job those farmers needed. These fish don't hunt. They swim with their mouths open, filtering plankton and algae straight out of the water column, clearing it as they go. Farmers imported them deliberately, dropped them into aquaculture ponds, and the ponds stayed clean. It worked exactly as intended, right up until the rivers flooded, as rivers eventually do, and fish bred for a 10-acre pond found themselves loose in a drainage system that touches more than 30 states. Within about a decade, the carp were breeding in the wild across the Mississippi Basin. They pushed north, found the Illinois River running through the heart of the state, and began climbing it. What made them functionally unstoppable was the math. A single female silver carp can release hundreds of thousands of eggs in one season, and in a warm year that number can climb past 1 million. Multiply that across every mature female spawning in the same stretch of river during the same few weeks, and you get a population explosion that nothing native to that ecosystem had ever been built to compete against. The damage those fish caused wasn't dramatic in the way people expect invasive species stories to be dramatic. There was no visible slaughter, no predator tearing through a food web. It was quieter and, in some ways, worse. Plankton isn't a minor ingredient in a river's ecosystem. It's the base the entire food chain is built on, and nearly every native fish species begins its life eating it. When a filter-feeding fish strips that layer out of the water faster than anything else can reach it, it doesn't need teeth to cause damage. It simply gets to the bottom of the food chain first. Species like gizzard shad, a plain, unglamorous fish that happens to be what bass and catfish rely on for food, began shrinking in size and number because their food source was being vacuumed out of the water before they could reach it. Survey data from the central Illinois River eventually recorded stretches where invasive carp made up as much as 70% of all fish present by weight. 7 pounds out of every 10 pounds of living fish in some sections of that river belonged to a species that hadn't existed there 50 years earlier. Then there's the part of this story that turned a fisheries problem into a public safety concern, and it comes down to one specific and genuinely strange behavior. Silver carp startle at engine noise and propeller vibration, and when they startle, they don't dive for cover the way most fish do. They launch. A 10-pound fish can come vertically out of the water, sometimes several feet into the air, and because these fish travel in dense schools, when one jumps, dozens more often follow within seconds. Boaters on the lower Illinois River have been hit in the face, the chest, and the head by airborne carp weighing as much as a bowling ball, at speeds that have caused broken noses, concussions, and lacerations. Wildlife agencies in the region have documented enough of these incidents that recreational boating on some stretches of river now comes with genuine warnings attached. A fish that quietly starves out native species is a problem for biologists. A fish capable of breaking a swimmer's nose on a family outing becomes, almost overnight, a problem for state legislators. That shift in urgency is what turned Illinois' carp problem into a national one, because of one crucial and entirely artificial piece of geography. The Illinois River flows northeast toward Chicago, where it connects through a canal system engineered more than a century ago to redirect the city's sewage and shipping traffic into Lake Michigan. That canal reopened a connection between the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes that had effectively been closed since the last ice age. Lake Michigan supplies drinking water to tens of millions of people and supports a Great Lakes fishery worth billions of dollars annually. A filter-feeding invasive species that had already devastated a mid-sized river system posed an existential threat to something exponentially larger and far more difficult to control. The response was engineering, and the engineering was extraordinarily expensive. In 2002, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers installed an electric barrier in the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, roughly 37 miles from Lake Michigan, designed to charge the water and turn fish back before they could swim through. It isn't a physical wall, it's a deterrent that has to run continuously and be trusted to work every single day. A larger and far more ambitious project followed at Brandon Road Lock and Dam near Joliet, where planners designed a layered defense combining an electric field, an underwater bubble curtain, acoustic deterrents, and a flushing lock mechanism, all stacked at a single choke point. The reported price tag for that project has run to roughly $1.5 billion. The logic behind it was sound: hold the narrowest point on the route and you protect the lake. But the flaw in that logic was just as clear. A barrier only stops the fish that reach it, and beneath it, there were tens of millions of pounds of carp spawning every summer. The barrier had to be perfect every single day. The carp only needed to get lucky once. It was somewhere in the middle of that enormous, expensive engineering effort that a different question started circulating among biologists and the public alike. Instead of building a better wall, could a predator already native to the region simply eat the problem away for free? One species seemed to fit the role perfectly, and it happened to have been locally extinct in Illinois for decades. The alligator gar is not an exaggeration dressed up for television. It's a genuinely enormous animal, capable of reaching 8 feet in length and over 300 pounds, with a broad, tooth-lined snout and a body covered in armored, diamond-shaped scales tough enough that early settlers reportedly struggled to cut through them with a blade. For most of the 20th century, though, the alligator gar was classified as a trash fish by state wildlife agencies, hunted and shot on the assumption that a large predator must be eating the game fish that anglers actually wanted. Combined with the loss of the shallow, flooded backwaters the gar needs for spawning, largely due to levees and dams altering natural flooding patterns, the species disappeared from Illinois entirely. The last confirmed wild alligator gar in the state was taken in 1966, and by 1994 Illinois had formally declared the species extirpated within its borders. In the late 1990s, in one of the more unusual reversals in American wildlife management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began raising alligator gar in hatcheries specifically to restore them to the rivers they had vanished from. Illinois joined that restoration effort in 2010, and the timing created an almost irresistible narrative. A native apex predator was returning to Illinois waters in the very same years an invasive fish was overrunning those same rivers. The story wrote itself: bring back the ancient monster, let it eat the invaders, solve an expensive problem for nothing. By 2016, Illinois lawmakers were publicly pushing to accelerate the gar stocking program specifically because of its supposed potential against Asian carp. The people actually running the hatchery program said, repeatedly and on the record, that this wasn't true. Illinois Department of Natural Resources fisheries staff were blunt about it. The gar reintroduction had nothing to do with carp control. It existed because a native species had been wrongly wiped out and deserved to be restored, and because it would eventually give anglers a new native trophy fish to pursue. The numbers made the case even more plainly than the biologists did. Between 2010 and 2013, Illinois stocked roughly 6,000 young alligator gar, and given the heavy mortality rates typical of hatchery-raised fish, only around 1,500 were estimated to survive to a size where they could persist in the wild. Set against a carp population measured in tons per river mile rather than individual counts, 1,500 slow-growing predators spread across hundreds of miles of river wasn't an intervention. It barely registered. The deeper problem wasn't even the numbers, it was anatomy. A predatory fish is limited by its gape, the maximum width its mouth can open, and it cannot chew prey into smaller pieces the way a shark or a mammal can. It has to swallow its meal whole. An adult silver carp is a thick, deep-bodied fish, and once it grows past its first year, it becomes physically too large for even a large gar to swallow. That gives the gar a window measured in months on any individual carp. Every fish that survives one growing season effectively retires from the predator's menu entirely. Despite biologists explaining this clearly and repeatedly to journalists, The story of the returning ancient predator spread nationally in 2016 and, in many corners of the public imagination, it has never really left. And yet the carp populations nearest that 50-mile stalled front really were falling, year after year, and that part of the story was never wrong. Something was genuinely pushing the invasion back. It wasn't wearing armor, and it wasn't found in a lab until researchers went looking specifically for it. The first documented force behind that decline is almost aggressively unglamorous. Illinois began paying commercial fishermen to remove carp, attaching a price per pound with a bounty premium on top, turning a fish with essentially no market value into a paycheck. Crews work through the winter using an adapted industrial technique, herding carp with sound and vibration into progressively smaller net enclosures until thousands of fish are compressed into an inescapable space, then hauling the entire mass out by winch. Across roughly 15 years, crews have pulled tens of millions of pounds of carp out of the Illinois River system, with the statewide total across all connected waterways climbing into the tens of millions of pounds as well. Researchers tracking the removal data, including ecologists monitoring the program, have described the effort as producing a measurably larger reduction in the carp population every year it continues. Some crews even use tagged carp, nicknamed Judas fish by fisheries staff, which instinctively swim toward the nearest large school of their own kind and lead boats directly to concentrations of thousands of other carp. Alongside the removal effort, Illinois tried something stranger, convincing the public to eat the fish. Carp is, by most objective measures, a genuinely good food fish, with firm white flesh and low mercury content because it feeds on plankton rather than climbing the contamination-heavy predator food chain. The obstacle was entirely cultural. In the United States, the word carp conjures images of a muddy bottom feeder nobody wants on a dinner plate. In 2022, the state spent roughly $600,000 rebranding the fish under a new market name, Kopi, short for copious, and rolled it out across dozens of restaurants and processors. The logic was straightforward. If restaurants order Kopi, processors buy more of it, and if processors are buying, fishermen have more incentive to keep pulling it out of the river. But neither the bounty program nor the rebranding fully explains why the invasion front has held at that same 50-mile line for over a decade, and this is where the real scientific discovery comes in. Researchers at the University of Illinois, including physiologist Corey Susky, had already found something troubling in carp collected near that stalled front, signs of genetic-level physiological stress consistent with animals living in contaminated water. In 2024, the team ran a direct experiment to test the idea. They collected water from the polluted stretch nearest Chicago and placed young silver carp into it alongside a control tank filled with clean water, keeping every other variable identical. The control fish behaved exactly as expected, actively exploring their tank, testing the edges, moving constantly. The fish placed in the Chicago area water changed almost immediately. They stopped exploring. They hung motionless in the water column, doing just enough to maintain position, while an identical fish a few feet away kept moving freely. The explanation, according to Susky, comes down to energy economics. As carp push further toward Chicago, water quality deteriorates, largely as a legacy of over a century of industrial and municipal pollution discharged into that canal system. Simply tolerating that water is metabolically expensive for the fish, forcing their bodies to spend energy on basic physiological survival rather than on growth, swimming, or reproduction. The carp aren't being killed at some invisible wall. They're deciding, in a biological sense, that continuing the journey costs more than it's worth. A century of pollution that Chicago never intended as a defense mechanism has functioned, by accident, as one of the most effective barriers against Asian carp in the entire state, reinforced by concrete riverbanks unsuitable for spawning and a series of locks and dams that break up the long, uninterrupted currents carp eggs need to survive. None of it was coordinated. None of it was designed. And all of it depends on money that has to be renewed constantly, whether through bounty contracts, restaurant partnerships, or continued funding for the permanent barrier still under construction at Brandon Road. Individual carp have occasionally slipped past even the electric barrier, recovered within a few miles of Lake Michigan in isolated incidents over the past 15 years, but every follow-up search using nets, electrofishing, and environmental DNA sampling has found no evidence of an established breeding population beyond that line. The lone travelers have, so far, stayed lone. What actually stopped one of the most successful freshwater invasions in American history wasn't a monster returning from extinction to set things right. It was a fisherman hauling frozen nets before sunrise for a few extra cents a pound, a chef serving a fish under a name nobody recognized, and a river carrying the residue of 100 years of human waste, standing in the water like a fence nobody built. The Gar is still being restored to Illinois waters today, and it deserves to be, but not because of carp. It's simply reclaiming a home it should never have lost. As for the carp themselves, they haven't left. They still dominate the lower river in overwhelming numbers, and every female among them is still capable of releasing 1 million eggs a season, waiting only for the pressure holding them back to ease, even slightly. Whatever is protecting Lake Michigan right now is real, and it is working, but it is also entirely provisional, built from budgets and contracts and a permanent barrier still unfinished. Nature found an answer nobody expected, but it's an answer written in ink that can fade the moment the funding runs dry.